She heard knocking, but no one was home. It was 3 a.m. and she was home alone. The power had just gone out, and as she was making her way downstairs in the dark, she started hearing these loud knocking sounds coming from inside the house. She tried to ignore it, but then it started getting louder. So she grabbed a flashlight and started checking around the house to see if she could find the source of the noise. At first she thought it was her boyfriend, but he was in the shower. She checked the closet and underneath the bed, but there was no one there. And that's when she started to get really scared. The knocking stopped for a moment and then it started again. It sounded like someone was trying to get into the house. She could hear them moving around on the other side of the wall. And then of course she turned around and she saw the most horrifying thing. The knocking was coming from inside the mirror. She heard knocking, but no one was home. A young woman was sitting in her room at night when she heard a knock. She lived alone, so she knew it wasn't company. She got up to investigate, but as she did, a vase fell off the shelf and shattered on the floor. Startled by the noise, she turned around and saw a dark figure standing in the corner of the room. She screamed and backed away, but the figure just stood there and motioned for her to come closer. As she approached, she realized it was her own reflection in the mirror, but as she reached out to touch it, the knocking started again, and this time it was coming from inside the wall. She could feel the vibrations in her bones, but when she called out, there was no reply. The knocking grew louder and more insistent, and she could feel the terror rising inside her chest. She wanted to run, but her legs felt heavy like lead, and as the knocking echoed through the room, she knew she wasn't alone. Something was inside the wall with her, and it was trying to get out. She heard knocking, but no one was home. It was late at night. A girl was sitting alone in her room. She was getting stuff ready for the next day, trying not to make too much noise so she wouldn't wake her little sister who was sleeping in the next room. As she began to doze off, she thought she heard a knock. She opened her eyes, looked around the room, and then shrugged it off. It must have been her imagination. She closed her eyes again and continued to get her things ready for the next day. A few minutes later, she thought she heard another knock, but this time it sounded louder. Whoever was out there was getting closer. Again, she forced herself to stay awake. She turned off the light, keeping her eyes wide open as she listened intently. There it was again, a loud bang on her door. She wanted to scream, but she held it in. Then she heard footsteps. She didn't want to scare herself, so she told herself that there was a logical explanation. Maybe it was just her dog outside, but when the footsteps got closer, she knew that wasn't true. She started to cry because she felt something terrible was about to happen. The knocks on the door grew louder, and then she heard a voice on the other side calling her name. "Help me," it said Lemian. She wanted to respond, but she couldn't speak. She tried to call out for help, but no sound came out of her mouth. Her mind was telling her to run, to hide, but her body just wouldn't move. Then the doorknob started to turn. The girl closed her eyes tightly, wishing it would all just go away. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The knocking continued, and she could hear the voice on the other side getting louder and more desperate. "Please," it begged. "I need your help. Don't leave me." The doorknob turned some more, and then the door slowly creaked open. The girl squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for what felt like an eternity. And then she heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching her hiding spot. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to make herself as small as possible. Whoever was out there was now just a few feet away. She could hear their ragged breathing and the sound of their footsteps getting louder. The girl huddled in the corner, hoping that whoever was out there would just go away. But instead, she heard a voice behind her say, "There you are." She didn't dare open her eyes. She was paralyzed with fear. She could feel the hot breath of the person behind her, and she could hear the sound of their voice right next to her ear. "Don't be afraid," it whispered. "I'm here to help you." She finally opened her eyes and turned to face the person behind her. She let out a scream, but it was cut short when she saw who it was. It was just her dad. He looked at her with concern and asked, "What's wrong? Why are you making so much noise?" The girl hesitated for a moment before responding. I thought I heard someone breaking into the house," she lied. Her dad didn't seem convinced, but he shrugged it off and went back to his room. The girl let out a sigh of relief as she watched him go. She had been so scared that he was going to find out her secret. She had been living in her room for weeks now, and she was starting to feel like she was going crazy. She had heard knocking sounds coming from the walls, but whenever she checked, there was no one there. She had even started hearing the knocking sounds when she was in the shower or when she was lying in bed. She was starting to think that maybe she really was going insane. That's when she decided that she needed to tell someone about what she had been hearing. She called up her best friend and told her about all the strange things that had been happening. Her friend listened patiently, and then she suggested that she'll come over and spend the night so they could investigate together. The girl agreed, and soon her friend arrived at her house. They made a plan to stay in her room for the night and see if they could hear the knocking sounds. They turned off the lights and sat on the bed together, talking in hushed voices about all the scary stories they knew. But as the night wore on, the knocking sounds started to get louder and more frequent. They could hear it coming from the walls and the ceiling, and sometimes it sounded like it was right next to them. The girls were starting to get scared. They huddled together on the bed, trying to comfort each other. Then suddenly, the knocking stopped. They sat in silence for a few moments, and then they started to hear footsteps in the hallway outside of the room. They could hear the footsteps getting closer and closer until they were right outside of the door. Then they stopped. The girls looked at each other in terror as they heard a loud bang on the door. The girl called out. There was no response. Then they heard a voice on the other side of the door saying, "Let me in." The girls screamed and tried to hide. They could hear the doorknob turning and they could feel the door shake. "Please," it begged. "I need your help." Just then, the door burst open and a man stumbled in. The girls screamed and tried to run, but he was faster and he grabbed onto them before they could get away. The man dragged them out of the room and down the hallway. They struggled against him, but he was too strong. He threw them into a dark corner and said, "I've been waiting for you." The girls were terrified. They had never seen this man before in their lives, but he seemed to know exactly who they were. He approached them slowly and said, "I know what you're thinking. You think I'm the one who's been making all of the knocking sounds. But trust me, I'm not." The girls shook their heads, but he continued speaking. "You're wrong. I'm not the one who's been haunting this house. I'm here to help you." The man's words confused the girls. They didn't know what to believe. He reached out a hand to help them up and said, "I know this may be hard to believe, but I'm here to help you stop whatever's haunting this house." The girls looked at each other and then back at the man. They knew they were in danger, but they also knew that they needed help. They had been hearing the knocking sounds for weeks now, and they were starting to think that they might actually be going crazy. The man seemed nice and they had no other choice, so they agreed to let him help them. He led them out of the house and to a car that was waiting for them. They got in and he drove them to a nearby motel. He explained that they needed to stay there for the night so they could keep an eye out for whatever was haunting the house. The girls agreed, and soon they were settled in their rooms. As the night wore on, the girls couldn't help but feel like they were being watched. They kept hearing strange noises and they could feel something evil lurking in the shadows. Just when they thought it couldn't get any worse, they started to hear knocking sounds coming from inside the walls of their motel room. They screamed and tried to hide, but they knew that whatever was out there was now inside with them. Suddenly, the knocking stopped and they heard a voice in their room saying, "I found you." The girls were paralyzed with fear as they heard footsteps approaching their hiding spot. Then they heard a voice right next to their ear saying, "You can't hide from me forever." They screamed and tried to run, but it was too late. Whatever was out there had found them. They ran to the bathroom and locked the door, but it didn't help. They could hear the knocking sounds getting louder and louder until the whole room started to shake. Then they heard a voice in the bathroom saying, "It's no use. I'm inside with you now." The girls were trapped and they knew that they were in grave danger. They had made a terrible mistake by agreeing to let the man help them. Now they were going to pay the price. Suddenly the knocking stopped and the voice in the bathroom said, "I'm sorry." The girls looked at each other in confusion. "What?" the voice asked. "Why are you doing this?" The girls cried out in fear. The voice continued, "I didn't mean to hurt you. I just wanted to talk to you." The girls were still confused. "Who are you?" the voice asked. "What do you want from me?" The girls screamed in terror. "Please," the voice begged. "I just want to be your friend." The girls were horrified. "Be my friend," the voice asked. "Is that too much to ask?" The girls cried out in fear. Suddenly, the voice changed. "You'll be my friends forever," it said. And then the bathroom door burst open. The girls screamed and tried to run, but it was too late. The man from earlier stood in the doorway with a twisted smile on his face. "I found you," he said. The girls were terrified. They knew that they were in grave danger. It was 3 a.m. and she was home alone. She heard a knock, then another knock. Someone was definitely out to get her. It started off innocently enough. She was just relaxing after a long day of work while sipping some wine. She scrolled through TikTok videos until she couldn't keep her eyes open any longer. So she poured herself another glass of wine and went straight to bed. Just as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard a loud knock. Startled, she poured herself another glass of wine and walked over to the window to check if maybe someone was out there. There was no one outside, only the dark silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. Still holding the wine glass, she walked over to the front door and pressed her ear against it. All she could hear was the wind howling outside. Maybe it was just the wind making a weird sound. She shrugged it off and went back to bed. But she hadn't taken more than a couple of sips of her wine when she heard it again. A loud knock. Like before, she checked outside, but all she saw were the same dark tree branches. Then she noticed something strange. A red light. It was faint, but she could have sworn that it had not been there before. When she turned away, the light disappeared. Perhaps it had been a trick of the shadows. Rubbing her tired eyes, she tried to go back to sleep. Then she heard the knock again, and this time it sounded like it was coming from inside the wall. The knocking grew louder and more insistent. At this point, she was too frightened to do anything but huddle in the corner of the bedroom and cry. And just as the door creaks open, the noise stops suddenly, completely. I wake up in my bed, drenched in sweat, heart racing. The room is quiet, too quiet. I reach for my phone, no signal. I try to breathe, to convince myself it was just a dream. But then I hear it again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. This time coming from inside the closet. The dream never ended. And now, I don't know if I'm still asleep or if I've finally woken up. And just as the door creaks open, the noise stops suddenly, completely. I wake up in my bed, drenched in sweat, heart racing. The room is quiet, too quiet. I reach for my phone, no signal. I tried to breathe, to convince myself it was just a dream. But then I hear it again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. This time coming from inside the closet. The dream never ended. And now, I don't know if I'm still asleep or if I've finally woken up.